In today's video, you will hear some of the scariest things people have seen and can't explain. If you like my content, do like and subscribe. I am creating content to try to raise funds for my dad's treatment. So if you want to support his ongoing battle, the GoFundMe link is in the description section below. Thank you so much for being here. And now, let's get started. Story 1. When I was a child, both of my parents left for work early, so they dropped me off at my grandmother's house for breakfast before school. After my grandmother passed away during my junior year of high school, I started coming straight home after school instead. Around this time, my mother began complaining that when she came home from work, the receiver of the phone in her bedroom, a typical 80s-style corded push-button phone, would be off the hook. She insisted that it was hung up properly when she left in the morning, and that I must have been using it. But I wasn't using the phone at all. One day, I got home a bit earlier than usual. To give you a sense of the layout of our apartment, when you entered through the front door, you could see the living room, the dining room, the kitchen door, and a short hallway that led to my parents' bedroom and my room. We lived on the 3rd floor, and the windows were narrow casement types with screens that were hard to remove. So there was no easy way in or out except through the front door. As soon as I walked in, I clearly heard 2 footsteps coming from my parents' bedroom. I froze for a second, then dropped my school bag and ran straight toward the bedroom, despite knowing no one else should have been there. It took only a few seconds to reach the door, but when I got there, the room was empty. There was no one inside. But then, I saw something that made my heart race. The receiver of the phone on my mother's bedside table was lying on the floor, stretched out as far as the cord would allow. I tried to recreate this later, shaking the table, tipping the phone, anything I could think of. The receiver would fall onto the table or the floor, but never that far from the base. The only way I could get it to match where I found it was by deliberately stretching the cord, holding it there, and carefully placing the receiver. After hanging the phone back up, it immediately rang. I answered, and it was my dad. He asked if everything was okay. Confused, I asked him why he was worried. He said he had called earlier, just before I got home, and someone had answered but hadn't said a word. He thought it was me. After getting no response, he hung up and tried calling back, but the line had been busy until I hung up the receiver. I've never been able to explain what happened that day. I know what I heard, those footsteps were real, but there was no one in the room, and no one could have left without passing me. The windows were undisturbed, and the clutter in the bedroom made it impossible for anyone to hide under the bed or in the closet. And after that day, my mother never found the phone off the hook again. Story 2. I've seen some pretty wild things in my life, but most of them can be explained. There's one event, though, that sticks with me, and it's something my dad, my brother, and I all witnessed. This happened around 1998, and we'd just moved into an old clapboard house on the edge of town. It had a big backyard, with a 6-foot wooden privacy fence on one side, and a 4.5-foot chain link fence around the rest. Our neighbors were on the privacy fence side, and behind the house was a small grass alley with a streetlight, followed by more yards. My brother and I shared a bedroom that was once a sunroom, with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the backyard. My bed was up against the windows, and my brother's bed was about 8 feet away, with the foot of his bed pointing toward the windows. One night, we were up late talking when my brother suddenly got quiet. At first I thought he'd fallen asleep, but then I heard him whisper in a shaky voice. I couldn't make out what he was saying, so I told him to speak up. He whispered again, this time urgently, "Don't move, and be quiet." Thinking he was messing with me, I asked, "Why?" But when I looked at him, I saw he was staring at something behind me outside the windows, where my bed was. I quickly turned around, and that's when I saw it. A massive, dog-like head staring through the window, almost nose to nose with me. There was only a single pane of glass and a few inches of air between us. I screamed. Not just a little yelp, but a full-on, blood-curdling scream. The creature immediately ducked under the window and ran to the side of the yard, jumping over the 4.5-foot fence like it was nothing before, disappearing into the darkness. My dad came running in with my mum right behind him. We were both in shock, trying to explain what we'd seen, but my dad brushed it off as a nightmare. My brother, for whatever reason, didn't admit to seeing anything at the time, so I took the blame and was told to go back to bed. But about an hour later, it happened again. We were both wide awake, still rattled from the first encounter, when we saw if this thing came walking along the chain link fence on all fours. The fence barely reached its mid-shoulder. It was huge. It sniffed the ground, circled a few times, and then hopped the fence like it was nothing, coming straight toward the windows. It got right up to the glass, nose pressed against it, as if trying to look inside. My brother, scared out of his mind, whispered, "I'm not dealing with this." And as soon as he stepped off the bed, there was a loud bang and a flash of light. The creature was knocked sideways, but without hesitation, it turned and bolted. It ran across the backyard, cleared the chain link fence, the alley, and the next yard in a single jump at least 20 feet, and disappeared into the night. My dad came charging into the yard with his shotgun, clearly terrified, and yelled for us to pack up. We left for a hotel that night, but my mum refused to believe we'd seen anything out of the ordinary. She wouldn't let us move right away, but we only stayed in that house for about 6 months before she finally gave in, and we moved out. My dad later told me that he shot the creature. He said he hit it with a 12-gauge slug from about 15 feet away, right in the ribs under its left arm, but the thing just ran off like nothing happened. The part that disturbed him the most was how, when it approached our window the second time, it was walking upright, on its hind legs, like some kind of person in a dog suit. But he knew it wasn't a suit. Everything about its movements was wrong. When it circled the yard, pretending to sniff the ground, it wasn't really sniffing. It was watching us through the window the entire time, like it was trying to fool us. Later, I asked my dad why he came out into the yard that first night, if he thought I was just having a nightmare. He said it was my brother who tipped him off. My brother looked so pale and terrified that my dad knew something was wrong. At first, he thought maybe there was just a person outside messing with us. But when he saw the creature under the streetlight in the alley, he realized we weren't imagining anything. He said the moment it stood up near our window, he felt this overwhelming sense of dread, like something bad was about to happen. That's when he knew we had to get out of there. Story 3. My best friend and I used to talk about all kinds of crazy dreams, conspiracies, and paranormal stuff. We were about 15 or 16 when he told me about a dream he had that I'd never forget. He said he was hit by a car while riding a skateboard, wearing all black, and in the dream, he died. He even described his own funeral and joked about how his crush was there. He said it felt so real that it really shook him up. It shook me up too for a while, but eventually I forgot about it. A few years passed, and by then I'd long forgotten the dream he told me about. Then, right before his 20th birthday, it happened. Just like in the dream, he got hit by a car and died. He was wearing all black, which were his work clothes, and the skateboard he was riding, it was mine. At his funeral, I saw his crush there, just like he had said she would be. Every detail he described came true, right down to the smallest things I remember from when he told me the dream. I can't recall everything he told me back then, but what I do remember matched reality exactly. It left me feeling like I was going crazy. I didn't tell anyone about it because I didn't even know what to think. I still don't understand how or why he saw this in his dream years before it happened. I can't help but wonder, what if he had never told me about it? Was there a reason he experienced that dream and shared it with me? I think about it all the time. I don't know what the purpose was, but it makes me believe that our souls go on after we die. If it hadn't happened to me, I don't think I would have believed a story like this. Has anyone else experienced something similar? Story 4. One day, my parents were pushing my elderly Nana in her wheelchair. She was about 90 at the time. As they walked, Nana started telling my mum a strange story. She said my mum's sister, Karen, had a friend who lived in Spain, and that the friend had been found dead at the bottom of a staircase. Nana added that the woman's daughter was suspected of her murder. It was shocking news, but in a somewhat trivial way, because we didn't personally know the woman or her daughter beyond their names. Fast forward 2 years later. My mum and dad were sitting in a pub when they got a call from Karen. She was in shock, telling my mum that her friend in Spain had just been found dead at the bottom of the stairs, and the friend's daughter was the prime suspect. My mum casually responded, "I know, Nana told me." Karen went completely silent. My mum was confused, so Karen clarified, "What? How? Nana died 18 months ago. My friend just died last night." My mum went pale and handed the phone to my dad, who had only heard one side of the conversation. My dad, who was as skeptical as they come, no belief in ghosts, religion, or anything supernatural, was asked to recount what Nana had told them about Karen's friend 2 years earlier. He described exactly what he had heard. The friend had died at the bottom of the stairs in Spain, and her daughter was the prime suspect. Except, this had only happened a few hours before. Everything matched exactly, down to the smallest details. Even now, my dad, the ultimate skeptic, just shrugs and says, "All I can say is that it happened, and I can't explain it." Honestly, the fact that he experienced this freaks me out more than anything else about the story. Story 5. In 2013, I was out for an hour-long run down a gravel road on a fairly well-known rural rail trail. It wasn't too busy, and I was a couple miles from the nearest parking spot, heading back toward my car. As I ran, I noticed a man walking toward me in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I got closer, something about him felt off. He looked older, maybe in his 70s. He wasn't homeless, he looked clean, but everything about him was grey. His skin, his eyes, his hair, even his all-grey sweatsuit, and he was smiling. Not a friendly, greeting kind of smile, just a wide, full-toothed grin that never left his face as he walked down the middle of the trail. He also had a black plastic bag slung over his shoulder. As I closed the gap, an intense feeling of unease washed over me. I started feeling nauseous, and by the time I was within 20 feet of him, I was almost sick to my stomach. I gave him a quick wave, but he didn't respond, he didn't even blink. He just kept smiling that eerie smile, standing in the middle of the path. I had the overwhelming urge to turn around and run the other way, but my car was in the opposite direction. So, I passed him, veering off onto the grass, because he still wouldn't move out of the middle of the trail. As I passed by, a massive wave of nausea hit me. The smell was overpowering, like something far worse than death. I started sprinting, putting about 200 meters between us, before turning back to see if he was still there. He was gone. It was a flat, open area where you could see for miles, but the man and his black plastic bag had vanished completely. To this day, I still get chills when I think about it. Story 6. When I was 9 years old, I was biking home one evening. We lived in the countryside, up a small mountain, and the road from the village had an uphill section, a flat stretch, and then another uphill leading to our house. The streetlights only reached to the end of the flat section. I was a bit scared of the dark, so I stopped at the bottom of the last hill, where the light from the streetlights ended, to gather the courage to bike the rest of the way home. It wasn't completely darker. Partial moon provided some light. As I looked up, I saw a figure walking down the hill towards me. At first, I felt relieved, thinking that once the person got closer, I wouldn't be as scared to continue my ride in the dark. But about halfway down the hill, the figure walked into the shadow of a thin tree on the road, and never came back out. It just disappeared. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, but panic eventually set in. Instead of heading home, I turned my bike around and sped back down to the village. I stayed there until my parents drove down, wondering why I hadn't made it home. They tried to explain it away, saying the person might have gone into the woods or something. But what they didn't tell me at the time, probably to avoid scaring me further, was that my father had seen the same thing once. Walking home from work, he had seen a woman walking down the hill. He watched her for a while, but when he glanced away for just a second and looked back, she was gone, and there were no footprints in the fresh snow. Years later, I read a book about local legends and discovered that many people, for at least a century, had reported seeing the same figure walking down that hill, disappearing at the exact same spot. Now, my youngest daughter loves this story. We've even turned it into a fun tradition, going on ghost stakeouts at the bottom of the hill. We bring pizzas, snacks, and hang out while listening to the Ghostbusters theme song, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghost. Story 7. About 25 years ago, my then wife and I were caretaking a house. We had been there for several weeks, and both of us started noticing this unsettling feeling whenever we went down to the cellar. It wasn't anything we could see, but every time we came back up the stairs and had to turn off the light, we'd feel like something was right behind us, ready to grab us as soon as we flicked the switch. Everything else about the house felt perfectly normal. We had an old analog wind-up alarm clock that we kept next to the bed. It ticked softly through the night, and to set the alarm, you had to move a small third hand to the desired time, like placing it between the 6 and 7 for a 6:30 wake-up. There was no way to really mess it up. We always had it set for 6 a.m. and didn't change it often. One night though, the alarm went off at around 2 a.m. The old school bells rang loudly, jolting both of us awake in complete terror. I was already on edge, but then I saw something, a small figure, maybe 2 feet tall, dash out of the room. I thought I was losing my mind, but before I could even say anything, my wife screamed, "Did you just see that thing?" We both described it the same way, like some kind of small gremlin. When we checked the clock, we saw that the alarm hand had been moved from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. Neither of us had touched it. There was no way it could have moved on its own. That's the whole story, but it scared the hell out of us. ... After that, nothing else strange happened, but that creepy feeling in the cellar never went away. Story 8. When I was in college studying in the UK, I lived in a house with a group of American students. We had heard stories about a ghost, a girl who had passed away while living in the house. I didn't believe in any of it, but it was fun to play along with the others. The kitchen had only one way in and out, and right after you entered, there was a padlocked door to the cellar on the right. According to the stories, that was where the ghost supposedly lived. I was the only one who had the key to that door. It was around Thanksgiving, and we were all feeling a little homesick, so we decided to cook a meal together. This required some creative scheduling, since the kitchen had very limited appliances. One girl, who didn't have class the next day, offered to stay up late to start cooking the turkey. Around the same time, we all went into the cellar to grab some larger cooking utensils. At 2:04 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my door rattling, like someone was pushing against it. I thought it was one of my housemates who had gone to the wrong door, so I didn't think much of it. But then, I started hearing a soft, scratchy female voice saying, "Hello," every few seconds. I assumed it was some drunk girl walking back from the pub, so I got up to close my window. When I reached the window, there was no one outside. But then, I heard the voice again, clear as day, "Hello," and it was coming from right behind me. My door rattled again, then everything went silent. I've had night terrors before, and I tend to hallucinate when I'm sick, so I convinced myself that I was still dreaming and lay back down to sleep. The next morning, at 7 a.m., The girl who had been cooking came to me and said, "I had the creepiest night." Around 1:50 a.m., I heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. Then the door rattled. At 2:10 a.m., I heard footsteps coming back down, and the door rattled again. She told me this before I had said anything to anyone about my experience. Story 9. I went to college in Providence, RA, and my dorm room was a typical setup. My roommate and I each had beds on opposite sides of the room, desks by the foot of the beds, the usual dorm configuration. One day, my boyfriend and I were hanging out in my room. He was lying on my bed while I stood near it, bent over to grab something. Suddenly, I heard him scream and freak out, clutching his eyes. He wouldn't tell me what was wrong at first. After a bit, he finally said that when I bent over, he saw a shadow behind me that looked kind of like him. He had an afro, so the silhouette would have been pretty distinctive. He was clearly spooked, but we didn't really talk about it afterward, and I didn't mention it to my roommate, since she wasn't in the room at the time. A couple of weeks later, I was asleep in bed with my boyfriend. In the middle of the night, I woke up to see my roommate packing a bag in a panic. She rushed out of the room, and since she didn't notice I was awake, I didn't say anything. The next morning, I asked her why she'd left in such a hurry. She told me that she had woken up in the middle of the night and saw my boyfriend sitting at my desk. She asked him why he was up, but when she looked again, she saw that my boyfriend was still asleep in bed next to me. My roommate was a believer in ghosts and paranormal stuff, so she freaked out and left the room. What really freaked me out was that we hadn't mentioned the look-alike my boyfriend had seen to her, but it sounded like she saw the same figure. Living in Providence definitely made me question a few things. Story 10. I was about to cross the street when suddenly, a lady put her arm across my chest and said, "Wait." I looked at her, trying to figure out what was going on, when a car crash happened right in front of me. One of the cars went tumbling down the street, just 2 feet in front of where I was standing. If she hadn't stopped me, I absolutely would have been dead. I turned to look at her again, but she was gone. I could see 4 blocks in every direction, and there was no way she could have disappeared that fast without me seeing her. The only thing I can come up with is that I imagined it in my memory, maybe because of how tragic the crash was. I've never experienced anything even remotely supernatural before or after that day. Story 11. My very first job was as a radio DJ at a small, hometown station in the mid-1990s. The station was located in a tiny building out in the middle of a field, with a 500 FT antenna out back and a single road leading from the main road to the front door. Behind my studio, there was the transmitter room with a light bulb that was always on. The station was so small that you could see that light from the driveway. There were only 2 doors, the front door and the back door to the transmitter room, which had no handle on the outside and was always locked from the inside. It was impossible to enter from the outside. I worked the evening shift, from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m., and after my shift, we went off the air for the night. I was always the last one there, so after shutting down, I'd pull commercials for the morning show, clean dishes, finish production work, etc. After working there for about a year, I'd racked up a few weird experiences. Shadows darting in the corner of my vision, lights turning off and on. One evening, I was just sitting at the board preparing for the next few hours, when I looked up and saw the perfect shadow shape of a man, probably 6 feet tall, standing in the doorway. It was there, then gone. I went to my boss, who wasn't exactly friendly, and asked, "So, I have a weird question. Have you ever felt like someone was here who wasn't?" She sighed, clearly annoyed, then yelled across the building, "Someone come here." When the person arrived, she tilted her head at me. "He's seen Jimmy." Apparently, Jimmy was the original owner of the radio station. He would pop in from time to time. "He won't hurt you. He's just checking in on the station." From then on, Jimmy would make his appearances. He was a harmless presence. My studio faced another unused studio, and the lights there would flicker on and off. I'd say, "Hi, Jimmy. Everything's going well," and it would stop. He even turned on a water faucet once and whispered my name in my ear one night, which freaked me out. At least, I think it was him. There was also another malevolent being at the station. It didn't have a name and was about shin high. This one always gave me a really bad feeling. It would dart beside me, its shadow flickering in the corner of my eye. I always knew it was there because I felt downright freaked out. One night in particular was the scariest I've ever been. It still freaks me out to this day. As soon as everyone left the building for the night, I got that feeling that something was there. I turned on all the lights, cranked up the music, and tried to ignore it. But the longer the night went on, the worse it got. Lights started flashing everywhere. A dot matrix printer in the sales office started running on its own, something that never happened. That office was locked. Then the ceiling tiles began moving, as if someone was hitting them with a broomstick. The tiles started closest to my studio, moved down the hall, and stopped at the front door. Then the locked front door opened. I went down the hall to close and relock it. When I did, I saw through the door window that there was a coffee cup and a cigar on the front stoop. There was no reason for them to be there. As I walked back to the studio, I got a strong burst of cigar smoke, like an invisible cloud right in my face. At that point, I didn't care about my usual duties. I went off the air, grabbed my keys, and bolted out of there. As I ran to my car, I glanced through the front door and saw a figure standing inside, silhouetted against the light from the transmitter. I peeled out of there and drove straight home. Now, that's all pretty weird, but it's not the most unexplainable thing that happened. Is it 100% impossible that someone sneaked in and pulled off an elaborate prank? Technically, maybe, but to this day, I don't know how it would have been possible. The building was old and tiny, but it still feels unexplainable. I got home and told my mum the whole story. My heart was still pounding, and she just said, "Shui, well, it's bedtime." So, I went to my bedroom and dialed up a BBS to tell someone what happened. As I was typing the story, my modem's speaker suddenly turned on. For anyone who remembers dial-up modems, the speaker wouldn't turn on once the connection was made. And if someone picked up the phone, the connection would be dropped, giving bad data. The speaker turned on, and a voice came from the speaker, mixed with static from the connection. It screeched, "Help me." Then the speaker turned off, and nothing changed on the screen. The sound of that voice is solidified in my brain. I remember the screech like it was yesterday. I have no explanation for it. My mum was the only other person in the house, and there's no way she could have done something like that. She wouldn't have even known how. It was the scariest night of my life. I'm as skeptical as you can get about ghosts or UFOs, but that night is beyond anything I can explain. As a footnote, I still visit that station from time to time when I'm back home. Jimmy is still known by the staff and the little malevolent being. No one else has reported seeing it. Story 12. This isn't my story, it's my uncle's. A bit of backstory. He used to work on the London Underground, maintaining the tracks and tunnels. Once, he went into a tunnel with two colleagues. They had stopped to do some work when a man approached my uncle and said, "Hey, uncle's name, can you show me the way out?" My uncle, thinking it was one of his team, replied, "You know the way out." He was so engrossed in his work that he didn't turn around to look at the man initially. Then the man said, "I'm so cold." At that moment, my uncle suddenly felt a chilling coldness around him, as if the air had dropped several degrees. Curious, my uncle turned around and shined his light on the man. He described this figure as what he would call a ghost. The man was holding an old vintage lamp and wore a dirty, outdated uniform. The feeling my uncle got was strange. He instinctively knew this man was a ghost. The man kept repeating, "I'm so cold. I'm so cold." Finally, My uncle said to him, "I don't think you're supposed to be here, mate. Can you see a light anywhere?" The ghost looked directly at my uncle and asked, "Can you help me? I'm so cold." At that moment, one of my uncle's colleagues approached, thinking my uncle was joking with someone from their team. But as he got closer, the ghost simply vanished right before their eyes. All three of them freaked out and ran, refusing to go back into that tunnel. Since that incident, neither my uncle nor his colleagues would venture back into that tunnel. Other co-workers claimed they had seen the same ghost, and he always repeated how cold he was. Now retired, my uncle still thinks about that ghost from time to time. Story 13. At one of my previous sysadmin jobs, we were closing down one of our smaller data centers, as it was being consolidated into one of our larger ones. However, we still needed to have at least one person on site overnight in case of server issues. We took turns each week, and I ended up doing the overnight shift at this particular location, which was reportedly haunted, though by what, I had no idea. I had only heard rumors from co-workers when I first hired in. Picture a large, open office space, completely stripped of all the cubicles and desks. There was just one desk left, with a few random cables hanging from the ceiling. Only the lights directly over my desk were working, casting a dim glow that bled into the surrounding darkness, making for a pretty eerie setup. I was sitting there, listening to the ambient noise coming from the server room, the whir of fans, the hum of the cooling system while working on a server for a customer. Suddenly, I saw something dart across the room in my peripheral vision. I looked up, but didn't see anything, so I figured my eyes were just tired from staring at the screen. I shrugged it off and went back to work. About 5 minutes later, I saw it again, and this time I distinctly heard the bathroom door open and shut. It was a heavy door that required a good pull to open, and had a mechanism at the top that pulled it shut. Assuming one of my co-workers had come in for a server fix, I got up to greet them. But 10 minutes passed, and no one came out of the bathroom. Growing concerned, especially since one of my co-workers had a history of seizures, I decided to check on them. To my surprise, the bathroom was completely empty. Now I was really creeped out. I left the bathroom, and as I did, I caught sight of the shadowy figure darting across the room again, but this time I was looking straight at it. Adrenaline kicked in, and I quickly turned on all the lights, determined to search the entire office and server room for a co-worker, convinced they were playing a prank on me, ... But there was no one there. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I spent the entire week on edge, half expecting something to happen again while I sat at my desk, my heart racing at every little noise. Story 14. When I was around 10 years old, I attended a family wedding. It was late in the evening, the full moon was out, and the sky was getting darker. My cousin, who is a year younger than me, and I were swinging on a big metal gate outside the venue. This gate led into a very large field. As we were swinging, we noticed a figure far out in the field, glowing and radiating white light. I mean, everything about him, his skin, his clothes was bright. We just stood there, baffled. We tried to get his attention, shouting at him. He stopped, looked in our direction, and then positioned himself directly under the full moon. He pointed up towards the moon while staring at us. We were in complete shock and confusion, not knowing what to make of it. After about 10 seconds of pointing, he resumed walking across the field and vanished behind a swing set. To this day, I have no idea what that was. I hope it was just some sort of costume or trick of the light, but it certainly didn't look like anything I'd ever seen. Story 15. 2 days after my wife passed in 2021, my kids and I were sitting in our living room, watching South Park, which she hated. It was the episode where the boys are trying to build a stairwell or ladder to heaven to get something back from Kenny's dead ass. The episode had Alan Jackson in it, my wife's favorite singer from her youth. Anyway, we're sitting there and live 360 on Min, and both the kids' phones goes off. Mum had left home, except her phone was on the counter in the kitchen. I thought it was just a weird glitch till I saw the location was the home of one of her Girl Scouts, a little disabled girl who my wife adored. I guess she wanted to go visit her one last time. It stayed there about 10 minutes, and then arrived back at home and never did anything like that again. That is all for today. If you have enjoyed this video, do like and subscribe, and let me know below of your thoughts. If you want to help in my dad's fundraiser, I would truly appreciate it. Hope you have an absolutely amazing day. You can also check my other videos on screen.